Good night, everybody.
Hello, hello.
Good evening, everyone. We'll be starting just in a minute here.
Everybody, this is just Maria from the SMA. I wanted to welcome you all here tonight and also invite you to fill out the survey evaluating the session at the end. I've just posted it there in the chat, and I'll also post it there at the end of the session.
Thank you very much, Maria. Okay, it's 7:01 by my clock here, so we will get started. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's EDI online learning session. My name is Namdi Ndobuka. I'm the member of the SMA's Equity, Diversity and Inclusion Committee, and also the SMA's physician lead for EDI. I'd like to start us off with land acknowledgement today. We would like to acknowledge that we are gathered on treaties 2, 4, 5, 6, and 10 territory and the homeland of the Métis. Recognizing this history is important to our future and our efforts to close the gap in health outcomes between indigenous and non-indigenous people. I do pay my utmost respect to the traditional caretakers of this land. And I also like you to just take a moment and also reflect on your role in reconciliation, depending on wherever you're joining today in the province. So the SMA has prioritized the EDI awareness and education for a couple of years now. Progress on EDI initiatives, as you know, takes time, and awareness and education are the key part of this process. It will take time to make changes that we anticipate within our health system, but I do believe that we at the SMA, as well as yourself, are on the right path. Tonight's session is entitled Introduction to Intersectionality, Power and Oppression, Unpacking Our Identities. So this is the second of the 4 sessions the SMA is putting on this fall and winter, and these sessions were designed to raise awareness on equity, diversity, and inclusion issues within the medical profession. The SMA's website contains information on the upcoming sessions, and I also invite you to consider attending those as well. So these sessions will be recorded, and the link will be made available to the members on the website through the member-only section. And we're also exploring having the future sessions eligible for CME credits for both MOC for Real College and also the main pro points. At the end of this session, we will be providing you with a survey link, as Maria did indicate earlier. We would like you to please provide feedback on the sessions and perhaps make suggestions on the EDI topics for the future. I'm very pleased to say that our presenter for all these 4 sessions is Dr. Manuela Valle-Castro from the University of Saskatchewan. She is the director of division. She is the director in the division of social accountability within the U of S, and she is originally from Chile and has a Métis background, and that means she's both Spanish, Italian, and Afro-Indigenous. She holds a PhD in gender, race, sexuality, and social justice from the University of British Columbia, and a master's degree in women and gender studies from the same university. So Dr. Valle-Castro is an experienced educator, both in the university and community settings, who is also deeply committed to social, gender, and racial justice and equity. She has extensive experience developing and delivering anti-racist and anti-oppressive curricula to a diversity of audience. So please join me in welcoming tonight Dr. Manuela Valle-Castro for her presentation today. What do you know?
Thank you so much, Namdi. It's always so awkward to hear to talk about your bio, and and I'm kind of excited to meet such a more intimate group tonight and to have the opportunity to engage with you. I am very encouraged by this collaboration with the SMA, and this is the beginning of long-term work, hopefully in which we really want to address the needs of our physicians in Saskatchewan for developing more their skills and supporting them. I also wanted to take a minute to acknowledge that healthcare workers, and including physicians, you are all stretched really thin again, and we appreciate our health professionals and our health frontline workers. And I really, really value that you take the opportunity, you take the time, you carve out the time, and you show up tonight, despite your busy agendas and everything that is going on in your lives. So I really, really appreciate it. And thank you for showing up tonight. I'm going to share my screen so we can get started. Namdi was talking a little bit about how we are working on creating sessions that are accredited. And for that, we really want to have you evaluate these sessions, as he was saying. So I really want to reiterate that you are sort of a little bit of our guinea pigs in this first time around of engaging with this material for a physician audience. And we really want to know how it lands in you. What are the things that make sense? What do you need? What do you need to understand better these issues? And so I'm gonna go into slideshow, and not gonna talk too much about myself because Namdi did a really detailed job of saying that, but I will say that we have two more sessions that hopefully you can attend. The third session, no, the fourth session of, well, this is confusing, but the first session is going to happen at the end because I had COVID when we had scheduled it originally in October. So our next session was supposed to be the last one. That's Introduction to Systemic Change, how to use your privilege in allyship. And then to end the cycle, we're going to have the session that was originally going to be the first, which is the Introduction to Unconscious Racial Bias. No one is racist, yet we have racism, and that's in January. Again, not going to talk too much about me, just lay out there the map so that you have an idea of what the scope of my experience, where the biases of my experiences, and where I'm speaking from. I wanted to share with you to begin an image that I developed for our online course at the university because I was really bored. I didn't want to keep using the image that you probably are really familiar, which is great, about the people watching the match, the game, and people are to explain the difference between equality and equity. So I created my own. And here it is. And I hope it helps us set the context of our conversation. So when we talk about equity, it's something different than equality, right? And this is something that is very important to distinguish. When we talk about equality, we talk about, well, the proverbial door, right? Opening the door formally to everyone to participate at the table. So, for example, it became legal for women in Canada to engage in public office in 1919. right? Formally, women have been allowed to participate in politics since 1990. However, when you look at the outcomes, for example, how many female prime ministers have we had in Canada? You see that opening the formal door, right? Making something legal and opening equality of opportunities, right? Doesn't mean that there is going to be an outcome that is uh, that every all if equity and equality were the same, we would have had half of our prime ministers be female. You understand? Because women are half of the population. So there's something that is happening between the formal equality and the outcomes that we have. How many diverse people do we have at the tables where decisions are being made, right? And can people participate equally in the table for decision making? And different social movements have been showing us that the reason that formal equality is not enough is that within organizations, people are experiencing barriers, right? And these barriers are related to the biases that the people that originally set up the structures and the policies and the processes of their organization had, right? So say if the people that created the institution were not responsible for childcare, they probably didn't think about providing childcare. If the people that set up the institution didn't use a wheelchair, they might not be thinking about ramps, thus creating what we call architectural barriers. Something that we have been learning from the feminist movement more recently in the Me Too movement is how women that have entered spaces that have been traditionally male dominated experience things like sexual harassment quite systemically, not as isolated things. We know that racialized people experience racial microaggressions, and that was the first session that we had um, last month. And it's very interesting. I was saying that the term microaggressions was coined in 1974 by a Black physician in the US. And it's very significant because we have to think about uh, the context of desegregation in the United States or in North America, meaning, and also of women entering these spaces, so that all of a sudden, organizations that were mostly white, able-bodied men, right, now had to interact with people of color, right, especially in the US with Black people that were entering these spaces, and with women. So that's when the term microaggressions is significant because it's these new forms of messaging that people get within institutions because those are legacies, right? Residues of structures of racial segregation and others. We have professional norms that are very centered on whiteness and thus punish cultural expressions that are not necessarily the say like British Christian norm, right? And along with that, there's lack of accommodations for religious diversity. And it was very significant in Canada when we had our first RCMP who was able to use his turban because he was uh, Sikh, right? So that was part of his cultural identity. So the work of EDI has to do with this space between formal equality and our outcomes, right? How many people diverse, who is on the table, and is that table proportionally representative of our demographics, right? Of the demographics of our larger community. Are there groups that are overrepresented and why? Are there people that are having more power than others, right? Those are the questions that we ask. Related to that, there's a very dominant narrative that we have all been socialized in Western capitalist societies we live, which is the myth of meritocracy, right? Meaning that it's like encapsulated in this idea of the American dream, right? That we are all competing in a level playing field, right? It's equal opportunities for everybody. So if you just work hard enough, you should be compensated for your merit. When that would be the tenet of meritocracy. And of course, this is, yeah, it's commonsensical. However, we also know that there's a lot of people that no matter how hard they work, there is institutional policies that reward other the hard work of some groups, and they don't recognize the work of other groups. So many social movements have showed us the barriers that minoritized groups, right? Groups that are a minority at the table, right? Even though they're not a minority in the world. Different social movements have been showing us and teaching us about these barriers. The problem then with thinking in terms of meritocracy, thinking that if you just work hard enough and if you're just smart enough, you are gonna make it, right? You're gonna be successful, is that those who don't make it, we're just gonna read it as if they're not competent enough, right? So if we've never had, to go back to the example of a prime minister, if we've never had a woman prime minister, we might think, well, maybe they're just not competent enough, or they're not even interested in politics, right? As opposed to, well, Canada refuses to implement universal affordable childcare so that there's more equity, less barriers for women to participate fully in democracy. Okay, so that it's important for us then to take a second and reflect, how did we make it to this table? Quite literally. What, and just for you to, you can, if you want, you can put it in the chat or you can speak it out, but what are the things that had to happen so that you could be here tonight? And for example, who couldn't be here tonight because there is some barrier? For example, I could think, well, who's not here tonight is somebody that doesn't have a computer, right? Somebody that doesn't have access to a computer. Or again, doesn't have anybody to leave their kids with, right? I don't need that anymore because my kids are quite grown. But what are the things that you needed, right, in order to make it to the table, right? That's kind of like the initial reflection that I want to take you to. And not only that, what things had to happen so that you could be part of the SMA? Or what are the things that had to happen so that you could become a physician, right? Because it's the reason that we need diverse perspectives at the table is that there's not just one perspective represented in the policies, processes, and structures, because that creates barriers, right? Bias creates barriers. So the more perspectives we share, the more equitable our spaces will be. Okay, so I can't see if anybody shared anything in the chat, but because I'm really technologically challenged like this, like I can't be share like on the presentation and sharing the chat. That's a little bit of a barrier for me to generationally.
No problem. I can read out the comments. It's Maria
Okay.
here. We have Mark Arcirda who says choosing to be involved. And that is the only comment that we have so far that I can see.
Okay. Well, I know that for me, it took to be in this table. I had to have the money to pay for my degrees. I had to, have the means and the ability to speak English, and to learn how to do these things online, and things like that. But let's move on. So this is what we shared in the blurb that you already read in the invitation, right? Intersectionality is a lens, is a way of looking, it's a way to examine how power and oppression are shaped, right, by these larger social structures that we participate in. So today, hopefully, you will be able at the end of this session to explain the concept of intersectionality, the intersectionality of power structures, and that you will be able to have some tools moving forward to think further and critically think about your own location. That's what we're going to be talking about. So the next couple of slides are a little bit of a recap about understanding a little bit of what we're talking about. So if you were in the previous sessions, I apologize. It's a little bit of a repeat. But what we're talking about, the context of our conversation, is that we are understanding that racism is just not about discrete incidents and events. Oh, and I actually have a very cool visualizer tool that I found. See, as soon as I try to do something, okay, maybe I'll share it at the end. But it's not just what we get to see in, when somebody screams a slur, or there's, a hate-based crime or shooting or something like that. Racism also happens, it's embedded in the texture of our everyday normal life, right? It's embedded in the institutions, and it's embedded in ourselves. It's internalized. And many times it's unconscious. For the most part, it's unconscious. Thus, we have to deal with the fact that our good intentions are not enough to guarantee that we are not participating in reproducing racism. We have to think a little bit harder about the impacts of what we're actually doing. And that's hard. But this is the only way to really understanding how oppression, and in this case, racism, has been normalized, right? In a way made invisible, right? Like if you ask the fish about the water, what water? But also because we, again, have inherited our legacy of organizations in the West world and in Canada, is that institutions have practices and policies and structures that reward some and create barriers for others, right? So the structures have a way of being that it can't be questioned. It's part of the normal of the institution. So for example, when a clinical supervisor tells a student that a patient is a frequent flyer, right? Um, that's a very loaded comment, as we know now, right? It's rooted on stigma. It reproduces violence against indigenous people, but it's something that is perceived as something just very casual and innocent, right? Because again, it's been normalized in the normal practices of the institution. So racism is not anyone's individual belief, attitude, or behavior, right? It's something that we participate in collectively. Thus, we have to work on it collectively and in relationship to each other. And again, redundant at this point, entrenched psychologically and institutionally. So anti-racism and what we're doing here in general in EDI work is to apply anti-racism and anti-oppression to organizations, right? And that means looking at the organizations in terms of how their systems are producing outcomes. What are, for example, the hiring practices, the promotion practices that are impacting who ends up being rewarded at the top of the institution? And we understand diversity as a natural effect of focusing on equitable practices, right? If we focus on removing the barriers, the natural effect of that is it's diversity, right? Not the other way. We can't force diversity to claim equity, right? And what we do again, it's an ongoing, sustained analysis of power. This type of learning and education is transformative rather than information-based. So what I'm just giving you here is a brief overview and introduction. But to really engage with this content, we have to have some experiences that help us understand the problem. Not as a, I'm not coming here to tell you, A, that racism exists, because I think we don't need to, that's not under debate, or B, that racism is bad, right? This is not about information. It's about shifting our understanding of what race is and how we can stop participating in racism. Yeah. So basically, our EDI work that we're aspiring to do is not just, so on the left side, it would be focusing on the other, right? And assuming that they're in some kind of deficit, right? So for example, we would say, what is wrong with women and indigenous people that are not becoming deans, right? What are they missing? As opposed to, what are we doing in our institution, which is the picture on the right? What are we doing in our institution, in our practices and our policies and our messaging and our discourse, right? That is producing these outcomes. And again, to stop participating, or to become aware of how to interrupt oppression and racism, we need to start by examining our own location. So this is very important. Before you engage in solidarity work with an oppressed group that you're not part of, and we will talk about this in allyship, it is critical to know and to understand your own story, right? We've had very, very ugly examples recently of people that claim to be indigenous to participate in indigenous solidarity. You don't need to be indigenous. You don't even need to be a person of color to engage in anti-racism. You don't need to be a man to be a feminist, right? But you need to understand who you are and where you are located in relation to other people. Because, like it or not, we do live navigating social structures of power. And it's very important that when we engage in this type of work, that we understand what are the aspects of our experience and our life where we experience privilege so you can practice allyship. For example, I am an able-bodied person, meaning I don't have any physical or cognitive disabilities, right? That allows me that every time I am at the table, right, I can say, hey, let's not forget about people that will need a ramp and ASL interpretation, right? I can be an advocate because I am there in the conversation, right? And then I don't have to wait for the person with the disability to advocate for that, right? Because that's the place where I have power. And this is the same thing that the Me Too movement was asking men, right? To participate in educating other men about uh, consent, etc. Right? It can't be the work of the oppressed group, right? We need to take responsibility for inclusion where we have the voice to do it. Right. And this is complicated to understand how we have power in different settings, regardless of our intentions. That's hard. We will talk about that. And under this paradigm, anyone who has in the area of racism that has privilege, right? Because you are either a settler or you are a European descendant, you are encouraged to become an ally in reconciliation, for example, right? To make these issues yours. Yeah. We'll touch on some of the terminology later, but settler lease is a term that is used to distinguish people who are indigenous to the land and people who are descendants of either European settlers or other settlers. For example, I would be a settler, right? I'm Chilean Canadian, but in relation to the land, I'm a settler here, right? And I've had really, really interesting conversations about this term because it has different meanings in different contexts, but that's a good question. So let's go into the term intersectionality. And a lot of people think that, wow, that term must have come from like, universities and, sophisticated, social scientists just created very, pompous language, like some kind of like, just to sound more sophisticated, intersectionality. This is some kind of like trend or something. Well, it's not. Very interestingly, the term intersectionality came from the experience of Black women during both the civil rights and the women's movement in North America. And even some people say that even before, when people like Sojourner Truth, who were one of the first freed slaves, a slave, previously enslaved Black woman, who articulated this idea of being impacted by more than one system of oppression, right? So, for example, in the women's movement, Black women, right, were being marginalized by mostly by mostly white professional women who were at the center of the movement, right? So Black women in the feminist movement were being relegated to secondary roles because of their race, because they were Black, right? And in the civil rights movement, Black women were also being relegated to second place by Black men, right? So they were given, roles like bringing coffee and administrative duties, right? So Black women who were participating both in the civil rights and experiencing sexism in the civil rights movement and racism in the feminist movement articulated this concept that there is an intersectionality of oppression, right? So it came literally from the streets, from saying, okay, so the march for the civil rights is going to go on Main Street, and the right for women's right is going to go on Broadway. Well, where are Black women supposed to go? Right? To meet at the intersection of both streets, right? There's a really brief video here that I will share with you at the end if we have time. But another very important author that articulated the term intersectionality is legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, who was studying, again, the case of a Black women worker who in 1976 sued a car making company. I can't remember if it was Ford, but she had not been hired by the car manufacturing company, and she made a claim against the company for discrimination. However, the judge said that the company had demonstrated that they hired women, and they pointed at all the white women that worked in the administrative duties, right? And then they showed all the Black men that they had hired in the shops, in the warehouses. So the company said, we hire women and we hire Black people. So, right? And what Emma de Graffenreid in her case was trying to articulate, that she was being hit by both structures, right? So it's a very useful and productive metaphor, right? The metaphor of the intersection of streets. And Kimberly Crenshaw uses it as, again, as a metaphor, a lens, a way of understanding how structures sometimes compound disadvantages or advantages, depending on these larger structures. This is another definition. I'm showing you several just to which one makes sense to you, but you can think about this, right? In terms, if you can take a minute to think about yourself, you can easily realize that you just don't belong to one group, right? Maybe, so, there's so many things that define you, right? It's not one thing. It's many, many different things. And these things change too. I think I talked to you about how I was being racially classified as mestizo in my home country of Chile has a different social meaning and different implications than how I'm racially classified here, right? So these also move. Again, different visualizers. I like this one. This one shows a little bit of how there's also a little bit of a spectrum between each one of these axes, right? So for example, it's not just a binary, but in each one of these areas, you have degrees of privilege or oppression, right? Let me show you. Oh, no, not yet going to the examples. Sometimes when people hear the word privilege, they feel completely triggered because they feel like what I'm saying is you got something for free that you didn't deserve because you didn't work hard enough or something. And that's not at all. What we're saying is that different people can put equal amounts of work and have different results and outcomes, right? Depending on their social location. We know this because we know that there's a gap in wealth and power between different groups. So again, privilege doesn't imply that you, it's not the same as saying you've never experienced hardship or trauma or anything like that. It means institutions, policies have granted you some benefits, right? So let me give you an example. Being able to access healthy and affordable food in your community or neighborhood, it's a privilege in Saskatchewan. And we know that because we know there's areas of Saskatchewan where accessing healthy and affordable food is absolutely impossible. Having access to stable and safe housing is a privilege, especially again in our province, in our city here. For those of you that are in Saskatoon, we are experiencing a huge crisis of people that are just not are unhoused and are experiencing the very harsh impacts of that. These are, by the way, these are some examples that I came up about myself here in Saskatchewan. These are some privileges that I have compared to other groups here in Saskatchewan. I have not been impacted by the, transgenerational effects of policies that have resulted in intergenerational poverty, trauma, mental health, addictions, etc. I never experienced, nor anybody in my family has experienced, required surgical sterilization. When I go to seek medical attention, I am not impacted by racial stereotypes here, right? So for example, I never get, asked about whether I consume drugs or if I had alcohol when I go to see a doctor or a nurse, right? We know that that's the experience of a lot of people. As I said before, I don't need ASL interpreters. I also don't need a ramp to get into events. I don't have to worry about whether the water I'm drinking in my community is poisoned. Yeah, so again, these are some of that I can come up with about my own experience that, again, just have to do with how I haven't been impacted by some policies that have targeted particular groups. So why do we want to talk about privilege? Is it just so we want to make people feel guilty and then have some kind of like oppression Olympics so that we can compare who has the most privilege and that person is the most cool? No. Right? The reason we want to talk about privilege is because this helps us develop a self-awareness, right? That of where we are. And what can we do with that self-awareness? Well, and first of all, as I said before, I want to validate that saying that you experience privilege in one area of your life doesn't mean that you don't experience oppression, right, in other areas of your life. But what do we want to do with your privilege? We want to practice solidarity. Any group where we experience dominance or privilege, any area of our experience, right, going back to that chart, those are the areas where we can practice solidarity towards the oppressed groups, right? Speak up to make sure that the groups that are not represented are able to come into the table. So it's important, again, that we challenge that idea that basically that if you made it into the, okay, I'm going to be very clear. We have to challenge the idea, for example, that we have among our students of medicine just the most deserving and smartest people at all. Are they smart and deserving? Yes, but there's others who are equally deserving who didn't make it because of systemic barriers, right? To make it there. When we apply this idea to health, this is very important because applying this type of thinking to health outcomes would lead us to believe that people that experience poor health outcomes are responsible, right, for their bad choices and their own, basically their own fault, right? As opposed to understanding what are some of these systemic barriers to wellness, such as food security and other social determinants of health. It's also important that we, again, understand our history and understand that whether you're, you know, a very 4 or 5 generation European descendant settler or a newcomer, that you understand what are the policies that have impacted different groups in Canada. So in particular, Indigenous people, because we're in a context of reconciliation, it's absolutely important, and it's part of the calls of the TRC to health, that we understand what are the policies that have impacted Indigenous people's health and wellness. That we recognize that, you know, we have, not because people are mean or have bad intentions, but we have to recognize that we have all inherited ways of being. We have been socialized into ways of being that are racist, sexist, and reproduce other power structures that are very harmful. Oh, and I guess I was so ready to speak so so much more, but I guess we can pause here and go back to some of the videos that I wanted to share with you. So these are, I'm going to stop sharing and share again, because when you do a video, okay, so share computer audio, optimize for video. Okay, so that should work. Okay, so this is a video, a short clip on intersectionality that outlines a little bit this history that we were talking about. I hope it provides more context.
Today we hear the call for full equality for women and distinctly for women of color from a multiplicity of perspectives. Intersectionality is a term we often hear, but what does it mean? Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the term in 1989, explains it with a metaphor.
Consider an intersection made up of many roads. The roads are the structures of race, gender, gender identity, class, sexuality, disability. And the traffic running through those roads are the practices and policies that discriminate against people. Now, if an accident happens, it can be caused by cars traveling from any number of directions, and sometimes from all of them. So if a Black woman is harmed because she is in an intersection, her injury could result from discrimination from any or all directions.
Intersectionality in all discussions of the rights of African American women today is built on the work of previous generations who have always been a part of the fight for full equality. Sojourner Truth escaped slavery in 1827 and became one of the most powerful women's rights activists of her time. She emphasized her identity as both African American and woman in her famous Ain't I a Woman speech at the Women's Convention in 1851. In 1893, Anna Julia Cooper addressed the World Congress of Representative Women saying, "The white woman could at least plead for her own emancipation. The Black woman, doubly enslaved, could but suffer and struggle and be silent." They demanded recognition of both the femaleness and Blackness of African American women in the struggle for political and social advancement. In 1951, the Sojourners for Truth put a call out to Negro women to convene in Washington, D.C. for a Sojourn for Truth and Justice. 132 women from 14 states responded. During the Sojourners' last Eastern Seaboard Conference, they discussed the organizational tenets of fighting against triple oppression facing working-class Black women of racism, sexism, and classism. Their efforts were a precursor to the Black freedom activism of the Black Power era and the Black feminist movement. Named for a raid led by Harriet Tubman, which freed more than 750 slaves, the Combahee River Collective was founded in 1974 by a group of self-identified queer Black feminists. Their Combahee River Collective statement was one of the earliest explorations of the intersection of multiple oppressions to include sexuality. They stated, "Our politics initially sprang from the shared belief that Black women are inherently valuable." The words and actions of these leaders continue to contribute to today's discussion around intersectionality, feminism, and civil rights that demand equality and inclusion for all.
Okay, so I think it's very important to give credit. I think a lot of people forget that we owe this term to Black women, and that's part of the problem, right? The erasure of Black women's contribution. It's part of the intersection of sexism and racism. In the same way that we can think back using this concept, why is it that in Canada, the people that experience the most violence and rates of physical and institutional violence are Indigenous women? And we know that because of the epidemic of missing and murder Indigenous women that, even um, got Canada to receive some kind of like admonition from international human rights bodies. I have another very short video. How are you all doing? Are there any um, um, questions that we could start for a conversation? Are there any burning clarification questions that we should address right now? Because I have another short video. Right, you're absolutely right, Liz. These hierarchies are contextual, right? So it has to do in which that's why I was saying that when I'm in my own country, I experience racial privilege because I'm not othered. I'm part of the dominant majority, right? So it's very attached to context. And yeah. So do you find it useful to start thinking in terms of how your experience is shaped, and maybe you have experienced some barriers and have had no barrier? So this is very interesting when you start thinking in terms of history, right? And again, in terms of these movements and the gains of these movements that have turned into legislation that we can now uh, use and address these intersecting oppressions. But what I really wanted to communicate today is the historical context of the term intersectionality and credit it to the social movement of women participating in civil rights and feminist movements, but also to remove this aura of intellectuality, um, jargon around it, right? Because it's not a jargon, it's a practical tool to understand how oppression works. And it's a practical tool to understand how to better practice solidarity, right? And how to work together to support each other, right? Because if I can speak, for example, for the rights of people who experience disabilities, right? I maybe can assume that when I'm not in the room and there's no other women in the room, our allies will be advocating for the rights of women, and they will be making sure that our concerns and needs are taken into account. So I'm a little bit curious to hear whether this still seems like too removed from your concerns or experience, or do you find it thought, what kind of what does it make you think? Where is your thought right now? What are you, what's steeping in there? I'm not finding the right metaphor. What's brewing? What's cooking? Stella.
Oh, hi. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can still.
Loud and clear, yeah.
Oh, good. Thank you. I'm not very technologically minded either, but yeah, I find that it's there are a lot of areas where it applies to me. I'm a white woman, and in the College of Medicine, one time, Dr. Alana Danalkowicz and I were asked to study or send out a questionnaire about what was keeping women from research careers. And it was very simple. Like the answers we got was a woman cannot take time out for maternity leave. She'll get behind in her research. She'll just fall off the scale. And so the only women who would succeed would be either single or childless. And we presented this to the dean, and it was not what he wanted to hear, but it was about maternity leave and not losing your place in the research ladder.
That is so very interesting what you're saying, Stella. And sorry, did I cut you off?
No, I'm done. Thanks.
I think your story is your experience, and it's very illustrative of the problem that we have formal equality, as I would say, and we have had it for a while. However, there's sort of like unwritten practices and things that are considered normal that, for example, penalize women's careers when they have to, if they're mothers, or for childcare, which it's kind of like shocking that it's something that we're still having to grapple with. And again, along with that, I want to reiterate that we have yet to see the rights of women in terms of accessible universal childcare, which is really the rights of families, not it's the rights of children too, to receive appropriate childcare so that their parents can provide, right? So these are very real barriers, like you're saying, Stella. And I would add, applying that intersectionality framework, when we want to know what are the barriers that are preventing women from advancing to positions of leadership in the College of Medicine, we should ask which women too, right? Well, how does it affect, what are the concerns and barriers that affect this group of women, or or have an understanding that white women might experience different barriers than indigenous women or women that have disabilities, right? So to be um, cognizant, right, of how those things interact. Right. So it's also understanding, to your point, Mark, that it's very interesting because in critical disability studies, what a lot of people are saying is that what we have is diverse functionality, and we have environments that are enabling or disabling. So it's not that people are disabled per se, but their functionality can be enabled or disabled by the environment. Yeah, which I think it's a really, again, interesting way of shifting the focus into the system and move away from that deficit thinking, right? Oh my God, my family doctor is here. I just realized. So I'm gonna shout out to Dr. Ojo. Chat. Sorry, I missed a comment in the chat here. So it says, people are shades of. Sorry, Maria, do you think you can read the, oh, here it is. In fact, there are not people and black people. Right, people are shades of colors. However, we had policies that explicitly said only white people allowed, right? In a way, we could say that Jim Crow created the terms black and white by implementing policies that decided that. So I agree. We all have completely, complex ethnicities. However, there's policy in Canada that groups everybody who is Anishinaabe, Mohawk, Inuit, Ojibwe, Nehiya, they're all under the category of Indian, right? Under the Indian Act. So policy, racial policy, participates in creating. So I agree. Uh, People are people, and race is a colonial construct, and it's a construct that enables things like the human trafficking or in the transatlantic slavery um, system, etc. So it's a way of categorizing humans that allows for the dehumanization of some groups so that they can be exploited, displaced, enslaved, etc. Right? So I very much agree with you, Mark. How are the rest of the folks in the room? Do you have questions or comments? As I said before, I really appreciate also that you speak your mind about whether these concepts are making sense. But even if it doesn't immediately apply to your say clinical experience, I want you to think and sort of like uh, let it sink, maybe, this idea a little bit more about why is it important to understand. And maybe I always suggest people that journaling is a really good way of reflecting about this, right? About reflecting on what are the again, what took you to be here, what had to happen to be here, what are the barriers that you did or didn't have to sort through. And again, how can you um, put in motion the power that we all have in some areas of our of our experience, we can practice solidarity and be allies. And allyship will be our next topic, in which we will discuss what is the idea of allyship, how we can, and again, since we're speaking about the civil rights movement, I don't know how familiar you are with the history of the civil rights movement in North America, but the civil rights movement would not have had the gains that it had if it were not for the amount of allies that also supported African Americans, right? There had to be white people that said, you know what? No, this is not okay, right? In the same way that it's still incumbent to those of us who are in a position to speak for other groups that continue to be dehumanized, stigmatized, criminalized, or incarcerated, that experience poor health outcomes and educational outcomes because of barriers and oppression, not because of their own deficit, as racism would have us believe. Okay. Questions now?
Manuela, I'll just maybe ask a question here. So I know you've highlighted quite a bit on intersectionality in terms of definition, which are great. So I was just wondering, what would be your elevator pitch description of intersectionality as a take home for all of us?
Pitch elevator. That's a good question. Yeah, let's see. I would say intersectionality is a pair of glasses that when you put them on, it allows you to see how different forms of power or systems of power are shaping your experience. Is that still too jargony? This is how many floors are we going in this elevator? You have 50 floors. Or I like to, if I had a pitch elevator, I think I would root it in the historical context that it emerged. And I would say it's a concept, it's a lens that Black women developed to explain their experience as experiencing both sexism and racism, and how they can't separate the impact of both, right? It's not like I experience racism on Mondays and then sexism on Thursdays, right? To put it in a way. It's a lens that understands, that helps us understand how those forms of oppression combine to not just to create barriers, but also to create advantages.
Awesome, thank you. And I think the video clip you shared on intersectionality was quite a good visual. So I wonder if that's something that you might want to push in the chat box for folks to take advantage and view as well. I think there's a question, there's a hand up there from Vashudha. Apologies if I didn't pronounce that correctly. Please go ahead.
I'm Vasudha Ergantla of Ophthalmology. I found your wheel of privilege very interesting. There's one other thought that came to my mind. Privilege can be inherited and it can be earned. So if you were born in a white family in, Canada or wherever, you didn't earn it. You were born, you were lucky to be somebody who was born here. I wasn't lucky to be born here. I was born in a different country. But then there is earned privileges. So for me, as an example, I'm a female physician, a surgeon, and you could say a woman of color. I immigrated to Canada, and so I enjoy certain privileges as a physician, but I had to work really hard. In the country where I was born, I had to
Right.
study hard, do all the exams. I came to Canada. I did not get those privileges. None of my degrees were recognized. I had to redo all the exams in Canada, relicensing.
Right.
And then I have certain privileges now, but I think I earned those privileges. And
Right.
literally, like the hospital grants us privileges to be able to do surgery or whatever.
Right.
So it can also be a spectrum, and you can be at two ends of the spectrum at the same time.
So what I would say, Vasudha, and thank you so much for your question, and I can relate so much to what you're saying. So privilege would be the inherited part, right? So having a Canadian passport makes crossing a border super easy, right? So you're right. If you're born in Canada, you already have like an advantage if you want to travel, for example. And it's not your fault, right? You were just born in Canada. You were not like oppressing other people so that you can have a better passport. Your privilege is always inherited, unearned. What you're talking about, your hard work and etc. Yeah, of course, that's your merit. That is absolutely your merit. I wouldn't call that privilege. Your privilege is not what you have earned. Your privilege would be the things um, that mark you in a way that, in that particular context, it provides you with advantages. And I find your question very thought provocative, though. So I'm gonna have to think about it more. I'm gonna have to think about it more. And my first reaction would be, no, privilege is just what you. I mean, for example, being born a man, right? Well, yeah, we live, in a society that obviously values, men and puts in the hierarchy. For a long time, men have been put at the top. However, that doesn't mean that you earned that that power, right? Right. But it's interesting because the problem that we're having with reaching equitable outcomes in education, for example, has to do with the fact that we're confusing, or we're not distinguishing between merit and privilege, right? So for our admission tools, as I was saying, our standardized main admission tool, which is MCAT, there's tons of evidence that the best predictor of um, success in MCAT is income. Mark, I absolutely agree with you. The point is that they stop being privileges, right? And that these things are just, for example, having food security should be something that is granted to everybody, right? But yeah, the problem with thinking in terms of merit when what you had is privilege is that then when you look at the people that that have not succeed, right? You can the groups, right? Groups that have not succeeded in the same rates than other groups, they can be read as inferior, as having inferior capacities or skills, or just not working hard enough, right? Actually, there's a really, really good book that we just read in my unit, and I'm gonna recommend it. That you need to know of the Indian. Okay, so this is a book about that. It's helped us a lot in my unit with my colleagues to understand a little bit how indigenous people have, have come to be in the situation that they are now, and it has a lot to do with policy. So this is a really good read. This is just an article, but the book is called 21 Things That You Didn't Know About the Indian Act. Oh, there's lots of comments here. Yeah, the biggest privilege is having rich parents. Yeah, exactly. It's like, it's as if we just looked at the world and we would say, well, who are the wealthiest people in the world, right? And then we concluded, well, this must be just the smartest people of them all, which we have learned recently that it wasn't true, as we see some companies burn. But you know what I mean? Like, we can't confuse merit with privilege. Merit is different. And if we were in a meritocratic society, right, then it would be sort of proportional, right? Some people would work harder, some people would work less, but it wouldn't be distributed along the lines of race or gender, right? Well, you are all very patient staying here for so long and listening to me. I get very tired of hearing myself talk. So do me a favor if you had a comment or a question now. Yes.
Hi,
Stella.
it's Stella again. I was going to let everyone know about a book by Jean Baker Miller. She was a privileged white psychiatrist, but she wrote a book about the psychology of women. And in this was in 1976, she was way ahead of her time. But one of the chapters was named Dominance and Subordinates. And she talked about all the features, all the behaviors you see in dominant people and in subordinate people. And then she expanded it to cultures as well. Being in the US, the one that came to her mind was, white and black. But when you read that chapter, it really opens your eyes. You can see where you behave like the dominant person, sex or race, and you can see ways in which you behave like the subordinate. So it's an excellent book. It's actually called Toward a New Psychology of Women, but it's I think the chapter on dominance and subordinates is the wonderful. That's the part I like the best.
That's very interesting, Stella, because again, these hierarchies, we learn how to, once we internalize them, for example, we learn how to perform them, right? So if we have internalized the idea of I don't know, women's inferiority or indigenous inferiority, right? We're gonna be acting upon those, even if they're unconscious. Something that I wanted to, it's still bugging me, this idea, because when you say Stella something like she's a white privileged woman, but like I don't want it to sound like having privilege is like a bad thing. like for example, I was thinking one of the things that we consider I consider a privilege is that I can walk with my partner in the street and not be scared that somebody's going to be homophobic because I'm straight. So, I I don't have to experience that, right? So that we would call it, oh, that's heterosexual privilege because I don't have to go through that experience that gay or queer people have, right? So
I agree. I think probably put it that way because she's a feminist, obviously, but she's a white feminist, and I don't think it's fair. But white feminists is sort of a criticism now. Although, and
white
she
feminism
did
is the
consider.
feminism that lacks intersectionality, but it doesn't mean that it's everything that white women do is white feminism. You know what I
No.
mean?
Yeah, and I
Right?
mean, she in particular looked at the issues of dominant and subordinate races and cultures
Mm-hmm.
and so on. So she definitely branched out.
Right. But you see the difference? Yeah, like white women can practice intersectional feminism,
Hmm. Yes, that's
or they
true.
can practice white feminism, right? Which is the one that doesn't take into account intersectionality, or the fact that, for example, and this is very critical to what you're saying, because as I was saying at the beginning in the introduction, Black women were experiencing oppression from white women in the feminist movement, right? They were being subordinated, marginalized, relegated to secondary roles by other women. So that's why the criticism of intersectionality to the second wave feminist movement has to do with, we can't just center everything on the people that have the most power here, right? We have to, and especially one group of women cannot assign themselves the right to speak for all women in a universal way, right? You have to think about, well, but what about queer women? What about Black women? What about women that have disabilities? What about, right? So that we can understand the picture in a more complete way. So thank you for that comment, Stella. It's yeah.
We've just got a question in the chat about asking Kathy what the name of the book she referenced was in the chat.
Oh yeah, 21 things you may not know about the internet, but yeah, you have the book, Kathy. Excellent.
Perfect.
It's a short read too. A short and sweet read. And to your point, Mark, earlier, the problem with being colorblind, exactly, and it sounds nice, right? When people say, well, I don't see color, right? Because everybody's human. And that sounds nice, but the problem is that when we don't um, acknowledge that people are impacted by racism and other forms of discrimination, then we still don't get it right. We need to understand how people experience the impacts of our practices differently, if that makes sense. But again, please consider this conversation today as a very introductory, um, invitation to engage more long term with these materials. We will be creating a planning committee next month in which you are all going to be receiving invitations to participate, so that we can review together um, more materials and talk about how to incorporate them in the long-term curriculum to be offered to physicians. Yes, Mark, I agree. We must recognize that, yeah, and especially in Saskatchewan. But yeah, I am very grateful again for your engagement, for being so present. And I was going to say that Maria is putting there the link to our evaluation form. We really, really value and appreciate all the feedback that you can give us. And again, if you want to come and become engaged more long term with this process of creating EDI and anti-racism curriculum, I'm going to write here my email. But yeah, the DSA at the College of Medicine is super eager and wanting to work with the SMA in the long term in supporting physicians in developing more skills and awareness and an understanding of some of these issues, so that we can finally also impact our physician wellness and also our patient experience, improve the outcomes for people that use our healthcare. So thank you so much again to Namdi, to Maria, to Brenda, to Ivan, who's not here tonight, and to each one of you that made it here tonight. And let's keep the conversation going.
All right. Thank you so much, Manuela. We really want to thank you on behalf of the SMA. Special thanks to our distinguished colleagues that were able to make it tonight. We really appreciate your time, and for the SMA team that participated, thank you so much for taking that time to join us well. Manuela, thank you so much. We really appreciate your expertise on this, and we really hope that the remaining session will also bring a lot of introduction around the allyship, which I look forward to. The next session here will be coming up December 8th, and we hope that you will mark your calendars. Reminder will be sent out closer to the date. We'll be looking at introduction to systemic change, how to use your privilege in allyship. I'm particularly interested in that concept of allyship, and we'll look forward to that session. So with that, I really want to thank everybody, and please take a moment to fill out the evaluation. Maria just put that in the chat box. We value your feedback. Thank you so much, and have a nice rest of your day. Bye-bye.